Okay, thank you so much, Hanne Bjustrøm. We're just going to rearrange the scene slightly so we can have a table for the three presenters. And then I invite the three of them to join me on stage. Obviously, this is unique in one way, and that's, I think it's the first time I moderated a debate where every single speaker has been able to stick exactly to the time allocated to them. Although we did start a few minutes late, so we're going to have to eat a little bit into your lunch break to have some time for questions and debate, and lunch will take place downstairs.
You want to stand in the middle.
But first, to get us warmed up. You all touched on the issue of how to connect the UN process to other initiatives. And of course, we could take many different starting points, but at the moment, the UN negotiations in Paris next year is the biggest show in town. So just to start with this question, how do you see the options for connecting other initiatives to the UN process, while at the same time ensuring that the UN process doesn't co-opt these and slow down the progress we're seeing? Because that's the trick to it. David, perhaps you want to go first?
I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of attention over the next 12 months to making Paris a success, especially given what happened in Copenhagen. I'm very worried that there's going to be so much obsession around just getting over the finish line that they're going to do the easy things. And the easy thing will be to take all the INDCs and add them up, print them out, have a big stapler, staple them together and say that's the Paris Accord. I think the harder and much more important thing is exactly what you're pointing to, which is how do you create incentives for these individual efforts to start to stitch together and connect? And here I think we should learn from trade. The same problem of gridlock in the multilateral process is happening in international trade negotiations, and so the way we solve that problem in trade is we have mutual recognition. So you have set up provisions inside individual agreements, and the Paris umbrella can help with this, so that there are incentives for countries to join existing small group agreements, and then over time they become connected together. And in some sense, we ought to judge Paris by whether those incentives are put together so that then in the few years after Paris, you see the beginning of that stitching together. I think that's going to be crucial. It's not clear to me that actually the people who are working on the strategy for Paris are focused on that right now. They're more focused on making sure something is successful.
Well, perhaps we can hear from one person who is involved. Jos, do you have any comments on this issue?
Yeah, well, we are not yet as far as David is describing. The UN system has been working in the past. Not perfect. We all know the Kyoto Protocol. After all, the number of participants declined. But we should give a participation go for Paris. That is the most important, because carbon leakage, the competitiveness pressure coming from policies, is a reality for us in Europe. It's also a reality in, say, in Asia or in Latin America. And that is the usefulness of the UN. You bring everybody together around the table and you point at the responsibilities of all of them. And the IPCC report in that respect is very useful. Now, I would bet to push Paris as far as we can in that respect, because the trade route of David is a route we can go, but it is a terribly complicated one. And two, it can give rise to a lot of acrimony. I was myself in the aviation experience involved, and they were all finger pointing at each other, and at the end of the day, nobody wanted to do anything. And now we could turn around the system, and we will see in 2016 what comes on the table. But using the trade argument, which we for the first time did in Europe on aviation, backfired the big way. And so we are very cautious because of the trigger it could have in making people unnecessarily angry, but also trade negotiations are terribly complicated. So the simplest thing for us on our table is stretch Paris as far as we can, and let's do in the United Nations Framework Convention as much as we can, and then see later, after Paris, after 2020, when either we can shape up the system through the United Nations or through other more bilateral vehicles. But I'm very wary of not opening up today an alternative route, because otherwise Paris is not going to deliver.
I'm sure Hanne has some opinions on this as well.
I have to agree with Jos that we Norway also is, of course, very committed to the UN ongoing process. And I think it's very important that we don't now start saying something which will actually make people think that this will not do and we should seek for alternative routes. But on the other hand, I think somehow there is something in between, because we saw both when it comes to the Montreal Protocol and HFCs, we have seen in line with the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, also where we try to do something. And there are some blockage because we have the problems within the UNCCC. And I think what we should like to see coming out of Paris is that a change of thinking. I think it will be very difficult, but in the sense that we could have some more general approach that we should try to do what we can do in the different UN organizations, and that there shouldn't be a blockage because we haven't agreed on an overall global agreement under the UNCCC. And that might be possible, especially if we manage to break the division between Annex 1 and Annex 2 and non-Annex 1 countries within the negotiations.
When breaking that division has been one of the big accomplishments of the last few years. That I think we're really, for most countries, with China in the lead there, we've really made a lot of progress on that.
I'm sure there are quite a few questions from the audience. Do you have a microphone somewhere to circulate? Okay. First person was at the back on this side.
Norwegian Climate Foundation. I got a question from Mr. Victor and Mr. Delbeke regarding finance. If you look at if you translate the emission scenarios into finance and investment, you see that there's a huge gap. We have to raise a lot of money to scale up and accelerate the investment needed. This country has a huge amount of money stored in the Sovereign Wealth Fund. How could this Sovereign Wealth Fund be used not as development aid, but as a vehicle for more investments into the low carbon sectors?
Are you willing to risk entering into the Norwegian debate?
Not whatsoever, but I would say that, you know, we have all the questions, all the pressures that you have in Norway, we have them on us as well. I think, you know, we are probably exaggerating the importance of raising international finance for having the climate actions being undertaken. The bulk of the money will have to come from the countries themselves. That's also in the European Union. How much money we shift around, the bulk of the money needs to be raised by the member states themselves. And that is the reality, because we are changing economic growth. So, you know, we have to provoke investment patterns in one direction instead of another. And that means that they have to decide that at the member state level themselves, and in the UN context at their level. So what is the role of international finance? Rather as a lubricant, but not as we were 10 years ago. I think one of the mistakes that were done in the negotiations in the Kyoto Protocol was to create the illusion that through the carbon market, for example, we would create a huge pot of money that then en vrac would be, you know, transported through the developing countries, and they would do the right actions. I think that model is behind us. We have to have the proportions right, also because there is no willingness for people in the West to raise all this money that is necessary. I mean, we should not fool ourselves, and that's why I'm involved in this debate every year, where finance has to be raised at every COP. The 100 billion pledged in Copenhagen, 100 billion public money. Get real, because the EU is raising half of the development cooperation in the world, half. So the other half, you know, the EU is only 28 member states. If we take the European continent, you know, still, but the other half, you know, where is, in terms of intensity of finance that is being raised, where is Japan? Where is Australia? Where is Canada? Where is the United States? I mean, in terms of proportions, I mean, we do our bit in Europe, but it's far not enough to raise the 100 billion that is now being said it should be public money. That is impossible. We will not raise 100 billion euros public money by 2020. We will have carbon markets, we will have incentive schemes, we will have private capital, we will have all sorts of capital, but the the illusion that was created some 10, 15 years ago, as if the United Nations Framework Conventions would raise all this money necessary, I think we have to leave that aside and we have to talk real.
I'm sure the others also have some opinion to this. David seems
I had just assumed that you had all the money in your briefcase and you were ready to. I think it's helpful to distinguish between public finance and private finance, and the gap numbers that are quoted all the time are usually overall. When it comes to mitigating emissions, the single largest barrier for private finance is the lack of clear and credible incentives that go back to the firm. And when firms see those incentives, we're going to see them start to make these investments. And I think one of the reasons I'm so excited about the Climate and Clean Air Coalition is that in addition to the practical impact you're going to have on short-lived emissions, is it's credible. And it starts to send a signal to firms that have frankly lost faith in the intergovernmental process and therefore lost faith that all this talk about climate policy is going to lead to action. It sends a signal that what we're doing is now much more credible. One last word on finance, which is, I think the finance around mitigation, it's actually relatively easy to see how that problem is going to get addressed. There's going to be some public finance and a lot of private finance, and it's going to come from credible incentives. Much harder finance problem is on adaptation, because there, the countries that are most exposed are the low-income countries. They don't have the finance themselves. The extra cost of fully adapting is going to be essentially infinite, so we're not going to pay for that for the reasons that Joost mentioned. And we have no strategy right now for figuring out how we would take new public funds, like under the Green Climate Fund, and figure out where they would be spent on adaptation projects, which countries, which settings, and so on. That's going to be the really big finance difficulty in the future.
Hanne also wanted to chip in on this?
Yeah, no, I fully agree with both of you, actually, that the way forward is to have the right incentives there, so you will see the private sector investments, because we're not talking about all raising this as public money. However, I think if we come to Paris and we are lacking far behind $100 billion, we will have a huge problem. And even if we will see some countries really still being on board, I mean, we have a lot of very difficult countries within negotiations that will use this for whatever it's worth and say that you haven't delivered. And it's especially in relation to adaptation. I mean, in relation to the very, very poorest countries, which have to have money for adaptations, it's difficult to say you have to pay the bulk of money yourself. I don't think we can do with that. And we should really put the pressure on a lot of countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, to come up with more and additional money.
If I can react
very briefly.
Very briefly. I'm not underestimating the role of finance also in the international negotiations, but I just want to have a word of caution, because the demands are without any limits, and it is simply impossible to create and nurture that illusion that all this money is going to come on the table. But there is one thing that can help in the debate, because we have to fight for the money in our parliaments, etc., if we have the performance-based, if there is no longer the illusion of a blanco check that is being given, but there is, if there is a proof that this amount of carbon is going to be delivered, then we can talk about incentives and prices for carbon, etc., etc. And that should help and come into the debate also when it comes to forestry. If you plant forests and you capture carbon, we can put a price on that, and we can say, okay, that many hectares of forest is being planted and grown and maintained, etc. That corresponds with that amount of money. So if we can prove to our citizens that the money is being raised for the good cause, it helps. But if it is an invoice that comes on us just for the sake of having the international negotiations rescued, we will have a very difficult task to do.
I wish we had another hour to continue this. I'm just going to allow one very brief final question. There's a future generation at the back, and maybe the father wants to speak instead.
Hi, I'm Heikki Holmås, a member of parliament in parental leave, as you can see. I would just a short question, and that is to the European Union, and then with a Norwegian comment afterwards. You are very strict on saying that your 40% is it's a domestic target. Could you then tell us the rationale behind such a position? that you bring into the climate negotiations, and let me have Hanne Bjustrøm comment on that, and whether this will also be the Norwegian position, saying that we'll have like a domestic target, and then all the different kinds of trading schemes being on top of that, instead of as an integrated part of our domestic target.
So very quick answers from Jens and Hanne.
I do not want to give the impression as if we are not engaging in international carbon markets. That's not the issue. But we had, in our public opinion, a lot of flack in saying, but you are just buying up very cheap CDM credits at €0.5 per ton, and you pretend you have a carbon policy. So we should reduce our emissions primarily at home. And that confusion and that debate has led to tell us, to our leaders, to decide we are going to reduce our emissions within the EU with 40%. Now, we add at least 40%, and the at least hints that there could be a scope for international credits. But I would assume that as part of the debate we still have to have how much, what is the international negotiations, what is the usefulness of that. Final comment, the CDM, how much we are defending it, is not an example of an efficient carbon market vehicle. I mean, the price has gone down to almost nil, and there are a lot of projects covered up by the CDM Executive Board on which the additionality, the environmental integrity are questionable. And that is the flag we get in our parliament and saying, hang on, it's cheap, okay, that's a benefit, but does it lead to somewhere? Is it useful to weaken our own internal policies on the basis of these carbon markets? So should we not a little bit more cautious on that? And so that is the context within which we have been deciding on domestic 40% at least.
Some very brief final comments from Hanne.
First, a very overall statement, and that is at home within EU is a bit bigger home than at home within Norway, and I think Heike understands what I'm pointing at. So at home, it's easier in the sense to do things at home when you have a bigger home. But having said that, this is something that the government is currently working at, and we'll get back to the parliament at the right time. So you will get the answer from a politician and not from me, even if we have been in the same government once, actually, the two of us. So I think I'd leave it there. But the point is, we don't know at all, actually, whether we will have a system for credit or offset or whatever in the Paris Agreement. Anyway, so that's also something we have to take into consideration.
The CDM did one thing very well. They were putting the attention of the Chinese on the role of carbon markets. So I think that was a very important side effect, not the CDM, but towards the carbon market.
These offset markets are very hard to get to function properly, and the CDM has been a disaster in large measure. I want to make one comment about the strategy here, because I think the comment you made, Jos, about at least is crucial. If every country comes into these negotiations thinking about what it wants to do individually, then the outcome of that equilibrium will be a huge gap between the individual efforts and what you need collectively. The whole game here is about collective action, about creating incentives for countries to do the most they can individually, which is what the EU and Norway are demonstrating, and then for the Paris process to create incentives for them to find ways to do more if other countries do more. That's how trade negotiations work. That's how collective financial regulation works. That's how success in climate change will work. And so it'll be crucial that we watch what those extra offers are that are made by countries and how those incentives are then glued together to produce true collective action. That's what's really been missing in this process.
Okay. Thank you all so much. It's been a great debate. I wish we had so much more time, but we really need to wrap this up. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.